American National is proud to support No Ceiling, helping to tell the stories of professional women. American National is dedicated to providing paths for leadership and advancement through the Women's Forum, a group of female leaders who provide encouragement, mentorship, and advocacy for American National female employees. With 4 corporate locations in Galveston and League City, Texas, Albany, New York, and Springfield, Missouri, the opportunities for leadership advancement are vast. American National believes taking care of business starts with taking care of its employees.
There was a lot of crying, there was a lot of staying in bed, and a lot of pajama wearing. And then I just decided, okay, let's try to make something better out of this situation. I can choose to continue to be like I am, but I didn't like who I was becoming. So I decided, okay, let's make this better. Let's do something and move ahead.
Today's guest is Stephanie Ireland, owner of the 20-year-old Springfield architecture firm, Ireland Architects. Stephanie says it's no wonder she ended up in this field. Her dad was a woodshop teacher and her mom was an interior designer and architectural history professor. But the road to gaining her license wasn't easy. She took a non-traditional education path and she experienced a setback earlier in her career when she was laid off. But Stephanie says she's drawn to a challenge. We'll talk about how that desire has led her to spend much of her career designing healthcare clinics and psychiatric hospitals. From SBJ Podcasts, I'm Christine Temple, and this is No Ceiling, a show that goes in depth with local women, sharing their journey to the top of their professions and the challenges and triumphs they faced along the way. They're rewriting the script on success, and there's no ceiling. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Stephanie.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with the founding of Ireland Architects, because you're turning 20 this year, and it was kind of a challenging situation of how that company came to be. So can you tell me how you started the company and why you had to?
You bet. Well, actually, I was laid off. Company had laid me and several other people off. It was during a downturn. Wasn't sure what I was going to do. I had passed my licensing exam, architectural licensing exam, and really kind of decided to maybe go back to school, get my master's. So I had also pretty recently been through a divorce, so there were a lot of life changes for me. So I put my house up for sale. I had talked to the university I was looking at to go to school and to get my master's in architecture, but it was the summer, so I was still packing up and trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life now. And during the summer, I had someone call me and say, hey, can you do some work for me? And I said, well, I'm not an architect. And they said, I don't need architecture. I just need you to measure a building that's already there and put it on the computer. And I said, well, I can do that. So that's how I started my drafting business. So my drafting business was from 1995 to 2000. And then in 2000, I passed my licensing exam. And that's when Ireland and Associates, actually was the name of it in the beginning, started. And then in 2007, changed the name to Ireland Architects. So really, it wasn't something I had planned, but it was one of those coincidences and fortune that I was like, well, maybe we'll try this and give it a shot. And I ended up really, really liking it. Mm-hmm.
So then what was your mindset at that time? Because, of course, being laid off is a shock, and you weren't expecting it. You had kind of, I'm sure, a path for yourself that you had envisioned. And then you're also dealing with personal challenges at the same time.
Yeah, it's not easy. And actually, I bet a lot of people are going through some of those same things right now. So there was a lot of crying. There was a lot of staying in bed and a lot of pajama wearing. And then I just decided, okay, let's try to make something better out of this situation. I can choose to continue to be like I am, but I didn't like who I was becoming. So I decided, okay, let's make this better. Let's do something and move ahead. So luckily, at some point, I just went, I'm done. Let's move ahead and see what we can do better.
Mm-hmm. And, I wonder, too, if the passion for your field was one thing that kind of pulled you out of it as well, because you'd really have to be, you'd have to have that passion and that drive to want to get back into it after a setback.
Well, definitely. And I took a wandering path to get licensed. So there was even, I felt like maybe more passion for me. At the time, the typical path was you go to a 5-year accredited college, and then you do 3 years of internship, which makes you eligible to take, at the time, a 12-section exam. Once you pass all 12 sections, you become licensed. Well, I graduated my undergraduate degree from what was Southwest Missouri State University, which is now Missouri State. It is not accredited for architecture, and I knew that at the time. But I graduated with an individualized degree. My mother's a retired professor. She taught at Missouri State. And she said, there's this other path you can take. Since architecture isn't here, Drury wasn't accredited at the time either. So there were very limited options in Missouri at the time. So she said, you can get an individualized degree. I had no idea what that was. But she had been in academics for a while, so she knew about this option. So she told me about it. She said, you can actually come up with your own degree program. Then you present it to the education board, and they decide whether it has has to have enough math, has to have enough electives, etc. And if it's approved, then you have what's called an individualized degree. No one else has that degree. It's still not accredited by the architectural world, but it has some components that maybe would help me in architecture. I took classes in computer animation, construction, interior design, as well as your basics, architectural history and math and English and all those. So I thought, why not? What could it hurt? So I came up with my degree program, presented it to the education board. They approved it. Yay. And I graduated with an undergraduate degree. But in Missouri at the time, I could still become an architect as long as I had 12 years of experience. Now, luckily, my upper education counted for some of that 12 years. But it was a longer process for me than going a route a lot of other people go.
Yeah.
So I had to be extremely dedicated and extremely passionate to get through all that just to become eligible to take 12 exams. So it took me a while to get through the process, but I was going to do it. I was going to make it. So even just the process itself was not traditional, and that's kind of how I seem to live my life.
Yeah. So how did you choose that path?
Well, I tell people it was destined. My father was a retired high school woodshop teacher, and my mother's interior designer. She actually teaches interior design. So in the way, my parents were divorced when I was young, and things were different back then, and the agreement was that my sister and I would spend summers with my father. Well, my father wanted to be sure that we knew how to be responsible and that, we have to work for a living. So even as young kids, my dad would get summer jobs, since he had school during the school year, that he could bring us with him on, and we would help him. We had to be productive. So for instance, we would build pole barns with him. One summer, we made ceiling fan blades for Casablanca. So I ran a drill press all year. I did all summer, and we stained the ceiling blades. So we were always doing something with construction because that's what my dad knew. That's what he taught his kids at high school. Well, then on the other hand, my mom taught architectural history and traveled all over the world. We got to travel, my sister and I got to travel some with her, and it was great because it was like an architectural, having your architectural history professor there, because we would go somewhere and then she tells all about it and where it came from and who designed it and why it was significant. So it was an architectural history course anywhere we go with her. So we did a lot of that, as well as she taught interior design. And as I said, as well as architectural history. So as well as far as the computer portion, when it wasn't real popular in the 80s, when DOS was around, if anybody remembers that, my mom had written a computer program that would tell contractors, like for instance, how many 2x4s they needed for a house. It was for really residential. It would help them with a materials list. But being in the 80s and computers and my mom being female, she was highly encouraged not to put her name on the program because she was female, and women don't know computers and they don't know construction back then, so she put her initials on it. It's actually stopped being produced now, but for a lot of years it was used by a lot of people. So really I feel like becoming an architect was a blending of my dad's, what he taught me with construction, and then my mother being interior design and architectural history. It's really just a blending of that. I just feel like it was destined to be.
Was there a particular trip or a particular time with your mom that you feel like you really fell in love with buildings and how they were designed?
Well, we took several trips to Europe, and the churches were always a huge thing to go take a look at, and there's a lot of teaching that goes into the design of a church. There's so much different periods, different types of churches, and so there were just several. And we took this one trip in Europe where we went to France, England, of course, and Germany, and we did a lot of time in churches and just a lot of teaching there. It's just so neat to sit in those places and really just take in everything. It can be overwhelming, especially if you understand how much went into the design of that building and the construction of that building. So it wasn't a particular incident. It was that we just got to have so many times that we got to go see these things.
It sounds like your parents also taught you a lot about hard work, too, putting you to work making ceiling plans all summer.
Yes, they did, but I'm very proud of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like I hit the jackpot with parents. My parents are completely opposites, and it's funny because my dad has passed away, but he's very practical and just do what you say you're going to do, and not a lot of BS. Let's just get to the point. Let's do what say what you're going to do and do it. Be very practical, which I loved. My mom, on the other hand, wonderful person, but she's part of Mensa, part of the 2% smartest people in the world. She's very, very intelligent. Never played trivia with her, just telling you, but she's amazingly smart. But she's a little social awkward, and we kind of give her a hard time about that. My sister and I love her to death, and my dad's, they're just completely opposites. But I really feel like I got a little bit of both of them. I got hopefully a little bit of my mother's brains, and then also a little bit of my dad's practicality, which is also part of the hard work. They both worked hard. My mother as well, extremely hard worker. She literally built her own house, 3-story house, by herself. She had help, but she did a lot of it by herself. And that's how she also taught my sister and I how to do some things. We always joke, we moved around a lot. And my mother would buy these older houses and flip them before that was a thing. But my sister and I always joke, we were always in trouble. And so our punishment wasn't no TV, no cell phones. Of course, they weren't. It was sand the floor. It was stain the wood in the living room. It was always something to do with construction because she was flipping the house. So with all that together, it really just kind of made my sister and I who we are today. And I give a lot of credit to my parents for that.
So then, was there a particular type of architecture starting out that you wanted to go into?
Well, I didn't know it at the time, but I got in a niche with medical work, medical design, and I loved it because it's never the same. It's always evolving, especially because of technology. There's always new equipment, new procedures happening with that, new processes, and it keeps me from getting bored. So it doesn't matter how many clinics I've designed, even if it was for the same type of doctor, every doctor works differently. So they're always different. So I've done a lot of medical design as a result. Also got into psychiatric hospitals and psychiatric adolescent facilities. So it's really just kind of taken me down that path.
So what goes into designing a building at the beginning stages? Because I imagine there's a lot to learn.
Yes, there's a lot of talking,
Okay.
A lot of asking questions. I ask a lot of why questions. And it's funny because I kind of have to prep the client saying, I'm going to ask a lot of questions. I'm going to ask you why questions because they're like, why do you need to know how we do something? And it's because I've learned over the years that a lot of times things are done because that's the way they've always done them. And it could be because that's the way the building was laid out and Joe is beside Sue's office because that's the way it was already laid out. But I've also learned that that's not always the most efficient way to do things. Just because we've always done them that way doesn't make it the best way for it to happen. So I ask a lot of the whys, and I make people think, okay, well, we've done it this way for 20 years. Is it still the best way to do it? Is it still the right process? Because the process, how one thing goes from to another, affects how you design the building. Back when we were designing a lot of medical clinics, you had to have all these huge medical record rooms. Well, you don't have that anymore. Everything's electronic. But now you have to have those IT rooms, and they have special things that have to happen, additional cooling, additional electrical. So there's a lot of questions that go on in the very beginning, and understanding why they do things like they do, so that we can basically work like they work in our mind, so that we can lay it out. When we lay out a floor plan, we're thinking about a couple different people. We're thinking about, for instance, with a medical facility, the clients that come in. We're also thinking about the staff that's working there. And then we're also thinking about the paper process. It's electronic now, but how do you get information from point A to point B? And those three processes can be completely different, but they still have to work together. So there's just a lot of questions that are asked, and because we want to understand what they do and why.
Mm-hmm. And you got connected with Mercy Hospital, then it was St. John's at the time. So what were some of the first projects that you did with them?
Actually, it was interesting. The very first project that I sealed as an architect, I remember our first pre-construction meeting was on right after 9/11/2001. So everyone, we didn't talk a lot about construction, to be quite honest, because of the incident that just happened. Everyone's mind was somewhere else. But it was actually an endoscopy suite over at Whiteside Medical Building. I think it's still there. I think there's been some improvements made, but that was my very first project.
And what was the connection like with the leadership at Mercy? Because you had just started your own firm. You were brand new. So, it seems like they put a lot of trust and faith in you.
Yes, I worked with Bill Seiler. At the time, was one of the vice presidents of St. John's at the time, and I had just barely started working with him when I was working at another firm, and he was really looking for someone who he could teach, that would listen and come in rather than telling him what he needed, because he'd been in the medical industry for years. He knew what he needed. He knew how things worked in the medical field, usually a lot better than the architect did, because that's all he did. And medical work is very specific, especially to the type of medical treatment that's being done. So he was really looking for somebody who would listen and really just, he could teach. I happened, just to be honest, be at the right place at the right time, and I was more than willing to learn, and I was soaking up everything I could find. I was reading books and asking Bill questions. Well, why do they do things like this? And, well, why don't we do things like this? And to be honest, some people may have been offended with those things, but he was more than willing to teach me and help me to understand why things were happening like they were in the medical field, as well as with St. John's at the time. Because the more I understood the end result, the better job I could do. So he was willing to take the time to teach me a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. So, I imagine that medical facilities bring a lot of challenges because of regulation. Mm-hmm. So tell me about how you work through that. It's not a strip mall where it can be kind of whatever you want, very simple. Mm-hmm. There's a lot that goes into it.
Yes, actually, regulations are a huge deal with designing any type of medical facility. It's really knowing which regulations apply to that project. Reading the regulations and understanding them, I'm kind of weird. I love that stuff. I love code. I love to understand the whys behind it. But knowing which codes apply is a huge thing. Does Medicaid apply to this? What about, are there any other state regulations? Because there can be up to 5 or 6 different codes that apply to a particular project. And then what do you do when they conflict? And so I have a lot of great relationships with a lot of these reviewers, city reviewers as well as state. So I ask questions again. I'm not afraid to ask questions. Well, why do we do this? And how did you come up with that? And why do we have to do it like this? So that I understand. If I can understand the whys behind code, then it's a lot easier to apply it, especially in a condition maybe that doesn't really align exactly with the words. If I understand the intent, then I can get the result needed and then talk with the reviewers to say, hey, I think we can get to that result by doing this because of existing conditions. And a lot of times they have to deal with those things. So they're open to the idea, as long as you understand where you're trying to get to make people safe, then they're really open to talking about other options.
And so you mentioned that you work with psychiatric facilities as well. Are there additional layers to that type of work too? Because security is then another big portion of that design, I would imagine.
Very true. Yes, there's so much more with psychiatric facilities because there's not only regulations, but then you also have to think about the safety of the patient, the safety of the staff. You want to be sure, for instance, there aren't any blind corners. Well, it doesn't say that in regulations. It just says, you want to keep them safe. You want to be sure they have anti-ligature points where they can't hang themselves or things they can't use for weapons. And you would be amazed at what people can use for weapons. It's really kind of sad at how creative they can be. So you really have to kind of think like them and to go through the building in your mind and think, hey, is this a safe situation? What about the staff? How can they be backed up in this situation? And how can we make sure it's as safe as possible? So it's really about keeping the client safe as well as the staff safe in the psychiatric facilities. Trying to do your best to make the facility also feel good. I mean, you remember the old asylums, basically, they look very institutional. Well, we try not to do that anymore. There's certain things that can be done to soften. We know so much more about colors and lighting and natural light and plants that we try to incorporate some of those things to help with the healing of the patient as well.
What kind of personal satisfaction does working with these types of buildings bring?
It brings a lot of satisfaction. We feel like we're part of the healing team. We're not a doctor, we're not a nurse, we're not there every day to help that person. But if we can make the building just a little bit better to help that patient, then it's part of their healing process, and we get to be a part of that. It's the bigger picture. It's about making your community better. It's about making people feel better. Just like as I'm involved with the kitchen, for instance. Bill Seiler had told me one day, he said, hey, the kitchen needs a renovation. The kitchen is a homeless shelter, as you're aware of in town. And I said, I'm there. I'll help. And so that's how I got involved with the kitchen. But doing all that, it helps you with a higher purpose. It's not about buildings. It's about helping people.
When we come back, Stephanie talks about the most meaningful project of her career, a redesign of offices and a shelter for homeless services nonprofit, The Kitchen. Support for Season 1 of this podcast is provided by presenting sponsor American National Insurance. We'll be right back.
Financial success? It's not just about money. It's knowing how to make the most of it. It helps to have your own banking expert who can offer guidance, new ideas, and smart solutions. At Great Southern Bank, you'll find that expertise along with a full-service team to handle all your personal and business banking needs. Learn what we can do for you at greatsouthernbank.com. Ranked a Forbes 2020 World's Best Bank by our customers. Thank you. Member FDIC.
Springfield Business Journal has been the business authority for over 40 years. SBJ strives to provide the most relevant, timely, and accurate business news you need to make important decisions. Locally owned and operated, Springfield Business Journal helps businesses market themselves to other businesses. Since 75% of the readers are the owner, GM, or VP at the business, SBJ helps your business influence decision makers when it matters most. If you need to raise your profile when businesses are considering your category of service, make sure you are differentiating yourself by using the Springfield Business Journal.
So tell me about your work with the kitchen, because a large building just opened from them, their new campus and new shelter that really you didn't know it at the time, but made such an impact in 2020, the way that you designed that facility. So tell me about that, how you got involved in that process and what that was like.
That has been such an awesome project. The kitchen, as you mentioned, we had a shelter that was finished about a year and a half ago, I guess almost 2 years now. And they needed a new shelter, and it needed to be designed specifically for them, as far as for their clients, I should say, and their clientele and how their clientele needed help. So it was a little different. So kind of thought outside the box a little bit, and luckily the kitchen was open to the idea. Luckily, I'd worked with the kitchen on and off since 2005, so I knew a little bit about their clientele and some of their challenges that they deal with. And so knowing all that, I could put it to use when I get to design this new building. So the shelter, we didn't know about COVID at the time, but it's actually mini apartments. So I took the idea of RV design, micro apartments, and hotels, and kind of smushed them all together to come up with the shelter design. So one of the problems they had at the shelters, they wanted to be sure they could fill a bed every night. But they also need to be sure that there was privacy, and some people came in with children, so there was also safety that was needed and security for the family itself. So we're trying to think of a way that we can make sure every bed is occupied every night, or as much as possible. And so we tried some of those ideas, such as the smaller apartment. The homeless come typically with what's on their back. So it's not like they need a lot of storage, because this is a temporary facility. This is not their permanent home. The time they spend in this shelter is just to get them in the system. What I mean by that is, if they don't have an address, for instance, they can't get a check from Medicaid. If they don't have an address, they can't get their VA benefits. You have to have an address for that. Well, if they're living on the streets, they don't have an address. I'll give you some instances. I remember there was a gentleman who they got in the system, and come to find out, he was a veteran, but they had been looking, I don't remember what branch of the military, but that branch of the military had been looking him for quite a while. Once he was in the system and had an address, he had more than $20,000 coming to him in VA benefits that he just couldn't get because he didn't have an address. They were also looking for him because they had a medal for him. So the idea is get these people in the system, and then also help them with the things they need. Do they need daycare? Do they need maybe to finish their high school diploma? Do they need help filling out resumes or job applications? Do they have some mental health issues? Can they get them with the right people? So it's really starting the road down to recovery or help. So this was a temporary shelter, so they didn't need a lot of storage, but they did need to feel normal. They didn't want the design to be a lot of beds in one big room. They wanted to be sure that there was more privacy. So we have bedrooms, they have their own bathroom, but we've connected some of the upper levels with doors, so that if you have a family of 6, we open a door and there's, on the upper level, there's 2 more beds. If you have a family of 8, you can still have all one unit and be secure in your space. You have your own kitchenette. It's a little apartment-size refrigerator, a little apartment-size oven, but it's big enough to warm up pizza, so it's all good. But really just trying to get the things that they need so they can get their feet under them. The whole idea, one of the things I've learned working at the kitchen for so many years, is if someone has security, knowing they're going to be safe, and they have food, then they can spend their time and energy on other things, such as getting their kids to school, or finding a job, or finding daycare. So the kitchen is really about helping them help themselves, get them on their feet. The second building with the kitchen just opened. Actually, I don't think it's quite opened up. We're still finishing a couple things. But it's a lot of the administrative offices, the case managers that now go out in the community to, once they get out of the shelter and they get a permanent home, they go to an apartment or a townhouse in the community. Those case managers then go and visit them to make sure that they continue to help them until they don't need help anymore. Do you need a ride somewhere? Do you need a bus pass? Did you get your daycare worked out? So that they can continue to be on their own feet. So this building, the second building, is more about those case managers' office, administration offices. So it's a support building, a support for not only the shelter, but all the people in the community that they're continuing to help.
Mm-hmm. Why did this work in particular interest you? Because there's no shortage of causes that you could be involved in.
True. I had been involved, though, since 2005. So it's been a passion of mine just to help people. And I believe in the kitchen's mission. I like that they are teaching people to help themselves so that they can be better people in the society. So it was really just a matter of getting in there, and I really am a champion for their cause. And it just so happened I was on the board for several years, and my time was coming up. I was president for 2 years, and my time was coming up. I needed to get off the board anyway because I wanted to be sure and have new blood. But that's when the shelter project came along, and I couldn't be on the board and be their architect at the same time because of conflict of interest. So I was like, okay, I'll get off the board if I can be your architect, because I really want to do this for you guys. I think it'd be awesome to be involved in this. So what's great is I drive by that building every single day, and I show my kids and my grandkids. We did that. We helped Springfield. We've helped so many people. We've been a part of helping so many people in Springfield get their life back together, help them get their feet back under them. And I will tell you, in 2008, when there was a big downturn, your homeless people didn't look like you used to think they looked. There was a lot of people who lost their jobs and lost their house. They were still just families like you and I. They were just living paycheck to paycheck, which we all normally do. But once they lost their job, everything was changed for them. So it was more of, I get to be a part of this, and it makes Springfield better. It makes what I do, like I said again, have a higher purpose. It's about helping people, whether it's with a business or the homeless. It's about helping people.
It seems like you also gravitate towards challenges as well. Even the way that you described getting into architecture with schooling. What is that? How do you? Where do you point to with that?
I don't know.
Okay.
But you are right. For some reason, I just can't seem to take the easy road. But I do love a challenge, and it's everyone handles challenges differently. I seem to handle them, it gives me the push to be better, to do better. Like, for instance, in college, undergraduate, I did go to Texas Tech University for architecture for 3 years, and in the studio there, it was a different time, but I was the only female in the studio class, and my professor, studio professors are tough, so they're made to make you tough. So professors are just really hard, studio professors. And this one professor, and of course in front of the whole class, proceeded to tell me he doesn't know why I'm even trying to become an architect. I'll never be one. I'm female. I'll never get it. I'll just get pregnant anyway. And that was hard to hear, but it was also the push that I said, watch me. And I'm actually grateful that he did that, because it pushed me to be better. It pushed me, I realized that someone else doesn't have control of my life. They can have an opinion. There's a lot of opinions out there. But I'm the one who can control how I react to things and what I do. I can't control the world. I can't control everything. But I can control how I define things in my life. Everyone has an opinion, but that opinion doesn't have to be who I am or what my life is. I can choose that. I can decide to take something negative and make me better as a result.
And you mentioned that you were the only female student in your architecture class. And architecture still continues to be a male-dominated field. And there's only a handful of female architects in town that are owners of their businesses. Although we have a very vibrant architecture community here, so I wonder, in this concept of diversity and inclusion, it hits every aspect. Like, why is it important in your industry to have diverse people at the table designing the buildings we eat, work, play, live in?
The more perspectives I believe you can get for anything, as well as designing a building, the better job you can do. Whether it's male, female, black, white, Indian, it doesn't matter. If you can get the more ideas, the more perspectives. Everyone is raised differently. Everyone grows up differently. So they have different perspectives. They've seen different things. So having all those perspectives and those ideas together always helps make everything better, especially designing a building.
Have you been a champion for women in architecture? Have you tried to get more women to participate?
I really try to get anybody who's interested. Now, I will say it's always nice to have people, you know that are similar to you, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's background, because you have more connections with them. And I think that helps, having a connection with someone, a mentor, someone that you can go to say, what do I do with this? What did you do when this happened? How do I handle this? Having somebody with more experience than you have just helps, because you can learn from them rather than having to go through that situation yourself again. It's kind of like being a parent. You know, you don't want your children to have to go through those painful things. A lot of times they have to go through them to learn something, but sometimes you can pass some of that education or experience to them, and that's what mentoring is really about, is trying to pass on that education, that experience, so someone can learn without having to go through the painful experience. At least that's your hope.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, you mentioned your kids, and so I wonder, because you mentioned grandkids too, so I imagine they're grown, your kids?
Yes,
okay.
I have two stepsons who have great wives, and then we have 3 grandchildren.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And have they gone into the design or architecture field at all, or what are they involved in?
No, they're more hands-on. I've got my 2 stepsons are more, one of them deals in a metal manufacturing company, so he's hands-on. And then the other one deals with more farm equipment. Because we're also rural, we grew up rural. We have land outside of Springfield. We raise buffalo. We have llama. We're kind of that rural kind of thing. So you know, they used to go fishing every day, and they hunt. So we're outdoors family. So they're really hands on. But I will say it's come in handy, because I do have a stepson who's thinking about building a house. So at least I get a phone call about that, and I get to be part of that, which is a really exciting. But my 2 daughter-in-laws are in the medical field. So kind of have I talk with them about some medical things sometimes, so I can learn things. They're always changing. But no, none of them have decided to go in the design field.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's the grandkids.
Could be. Let's hope.
Yeah. Well, I just can't get over the fact that you said you have llamas, too.
Yes, actually we did. They've both passed away.
Okay.
We had 2. We had Scotty, and then we had Dolly.
Yeah.
Llama.
Nice.
Yeah, so it was a lot of fun. We know we have this misfit farm. We take in anything, I swear. But, you know, we have a pig right now, and chickens and dogs and cats, and we have buffalo right now. So we're kind of down to just not very many animals right now. It just depends on what shows up.
That's great.
We help out. Yeah, it's fun.
So, you know, of course, Ireland Architects is still going strong.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I wonder what you imagine for the future of the firm, and what are some other projects you want to take on?
Well, actually, now that you say that, last week we actually have a firm, Burns Architecture, and my firm have come together.
Oh, wow.
And they moved in last week.
Wow.
Larry Burns is wanting to step back. He's wanting to semi-retire. So we've been talking about a partnership. So he just last week moved in. So, and what's interesting is his projects are different than what our projects have been. His projects have been more apartment buildings, hotels, those types of things, whereas that's not been our wheelhouse. So it brings a great opportunity for different types of clients. So actually, that's part of how we're growing Ireland Architects, is basically merging with Burns Architecture and doing some different type of work there. And then also in the future, to be honest, we're trying to look into the future a little bit more. I don't know what that looks like, but trying to do some planning, and what does architecture and architects look like in the future? We were already paperless 12 years ago now. So we've already done that. We've been there, done that. You know, we're also using all of the virtual you know, the Zoom meetings, the screen sharing meetings, all that. We've been doing that for quite a while. So that was definitely an easy transition during the COVID. We were working from home, and then also working in the office whenever it's convenient. But we had been doing that for years because I also have some other females working in the office, and they would need to be home with the kids. Well, they could work from home then. So we were already working on those types of things in the meantime. But really looking ahead at what architecture looks like in the future. I've been doing a lot of thinking about that. And I don't know what that looks like, but trying to stay ahead of the curve. because if you're behind the curve, you're late. So trying to look at what might be in the future and how might architecture look in the future, as far as plans and meeting with people. And now with all the virtual technology, project can be anywhere. Doesn't really matter where it is. Wow. So it makes it easier to also look additional places for work too. Yeah. So there's some opportunities out there.
And you had already expanded the ability to work in multi-states through some additional certifications and schooling.
Yes, I went back to school in 2011.
Okay.
And to get my master's in architecture that was accredited. Remember I said my undergraduate was not accredited by NAB, the architectural.
So you learned better this next time.
Yes. So I went an easier route, I suppose. This is only 2.5 years of school.
Okay.
But I went to Boston Architectural College, and it was the first, and I don't know if it's still the only, but NAB accredited architectural program that was partly virtual or remotely. Oh, wow. I would go to Boston once a semester for 10 days straight, and they would call an intensive. And we literally would have classes or working on projects 18 to 20 hours a day straight, no weekends type thing. Yeah. And that's how you basically started your project for the semester. And then you continued your project through the semester. And we had virtual, just like we're doing now, with a lot of things. And then we would meet Skype with our professors and with our cohorts, and work together on projects that way as well. So that was something going on already I was doing with my master's program. In 2014 I graduated with a Master of Architecture, which then allowed me to work outside of the state of Missouri.
Yeah.
Just took me a little longer to get there.
So do you have plans to expand those states then? Or are there particular states that you're looking at, or is it really the project that you're looking for?
It's really the project or the client. I've done work in Arkansas, Kansas. I'm also licensed in Texas, I think Oklahoma, several places, I think Florida. So it's really kind of where the project takes you, to be able to get licensed in that state and then be able to do projects there.
Do you have a dream project?
Yes. It's more about an idea of taking a building, an abandoned building, for instance, and try to repurpose it for something that you wouldn't think would really work, or you maybe not had maybe not thought about it. I do a lot of reading, and for instance, like there's a lot of old empty malls anymore, and I've been reading some things about what people are doing with those malls. I just hate to see buildings, old schools. Another thing that's really hard what do you do with a school, that's no longer needed, or there's these odd buildings that you don't know what to do with them. I would love to be able to get into something like that and make it something purposeful. Not tear it down, but use as much of it as possible and make it useful. And I don't know what that looks like. Maybe I'll get that chance. Yeah. I hope.
And are you thinking that would be something in this community?
Yeah, I'd like it to be. I really would. Yeah. I think those old grain elevators are really neat. What could we do with those? It would be very interesting to think about. What could you do with those? Yeah. You just see them every time you drive around Springfield, and they're in prominent locations because they were built at the time in the rural areas, which are not rural anymore. They're in the middle of the city. So things like that, old malls, old schools, the grain elevators, something, what could we do with those? That would be fun.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Stephanie. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it as well.
Thanks for listening. You can subscribe to No Ceiling from SBJ Podcasts wherever you find your podcasts, or watch videos from the interviews by visiting sbj.net/No Ceiling. This show is produced by AdSmith Studio, with special thanks to Dustin Henderson and Joe Stearns. Photography and design by SBJ's Mackenzie Robinson. American National Insurance is the show's presenting sponsor, with support by Great Southern Bank. I'm Christine Temple, and this is No Ceiling.